One of the things that I find more and more concerning as I get older, as I become a glasses wearing high level intellectual on the internet.com, is polarization. Now, let me be clear about something. Let me break something down for you right at the jump, right at the beginning of this video. I'm not too concerned about political polarization. Obviously, there is a point where political polarization can become a problem, but let's be clear about all the naysayers and doomsday forecasters. We had a civil war in this nation. There have been more polarizing times in the country that we're currently living in. Everybody calm down. But what I'm concerned about, what bothers me, what actually does keep me a little bit awake at night, is the idea of racial, ethnic, or religious polarization. Now, the reason this concerns me above and beyond the concern I have for political polarization is because we have a nation that is designed to be a 50-state nation, so political differences can be reflected at the state level. However, severe religious differences, severe language differences, severe racial or ethnic differences cannot be brokered by the 50-state solution because we don't have states based on ethnicity. That's not how this nation works. And this actually came up recently in a mild way when I was driving around with my girlfriend and we noticed that we were in an Asian neighborhood. And one of the ways that you can notice you're in an Asian neighborhood is all the signs will be in Chinese or Korean or whatever language that is predominant in that neighborhood. And my girlfriend and I were discussing this and how basically these stores are essentially designed to cater to a certain ethnic group, and people who are not of that ethnic group may sometimes feel unwelcome in there because the sign literally doesn't tell them in a way that they understand what the store actually is. And through the discussion that me and my girlfriend had, we ended up coming to the conclusion, or I ended up stating quite clearly, that it's actually a really good thing that the black population in the United States of America doesn't speak another language. Because if we added on a linguistic barrier or a religious barrier onto the historic barriers of race and ethnic origin between blacks and whites or any group of people in the United States, things could get a lot worse. We could end up in a situation where we have a minority population that wants a breakaway state, and thankfully we don't have that. However, that doesn't mean everything is healthy in our nation. That doesn't mean that everything is ketoed to the way we're in balance. Because today we're going to talk about a Florida jury refusing to convict a guilty man of murder because the guilty man who committed this murder was a young black man. But of course, I did my sponsor transition, so we're going to go to the sponsor and then we'll come back. Oh my god, I can't talk. If you're trying to stick to your fitness New Year's resolutions, you might want to introduce a keto powder in order to speed up your results. A good keto supplement will actually keep you in a prolonged fat-burning state known as ketosis for as long as possible, and the keto powder that I recommend right here on this channel is Keto with Justice. This ultra-rich powder helps deliver clean energy, mental focus, and weight management throughout your body. This product uses powerhouse ingredients to support elevated ketone levels and all of the confidence-boosting benefits that come with it. Now, I partnered with the creators of this amazing keto powder in order to get you guys a 51% discount in order to celebrate the new year. Just go to ketowithjustice.com or click the link in the pinned comment or the top of the description and order yours today.
A jury foreman speaking out about what was going through her mind moments before a high-profile murder case ended in a mistrial. 7's Nicole Insalata reports.
We just need to follow the law as they instructed us to do and not put our emotions into this.
So the story that really had me concerned about racial polarization in this nation comes out of Broward County, Florida, where a Florida jury actually did not convict based on first-degree or second-degree murder charges and believed that they were going to compromise on a manslaughter charge when a juror had a crisis of conscience and refused to stand by the verdict because she believed that Dayonte was in fact guilty of murder. And after looking over this case, after examining the facts that were presented in trial, I just have to say 100% Dayonte was guilty of murder. However, some of the juries were holding out on the murder conviction, and the reason why they decided to hold out and not convict Dayonte of the crime that he definitely committed is incredibly troubling.
But one of the jurors charged with deciding the fate of accused murderer Dayonte Resiles says that's exactly what happened in the jury room. The trial ended this week with a hung jury, and the foreperson says 3 jurors were unwilling to convict Resiles based on his race.
That's right, you heard it clearly. The foreperson in the Dayonte Resiles case down in Broward County, Florida, said that when they went into the jury room, 9 out of 12 jurors were ready to convict Dayonte of murder. However, 3 jurors absolutely refused to hear any arguments based on first or second degree murder because they did not want to send a young black man to death row or give him life in prison.
They said, I don't want to send a young black male to jail for the rest of their life or have them get the death sentence.
Resiles could face either of those most severe penalties if he's convicted of killing Jill Sue.
This is not something that is a dispute of the facts of the case, which we will get into a little bit later. This is totally based on the race/ethnic origin of Dayonte and Jill Sue, the victim in this case. And the prosecution has an incredibly solid case against Dayonte. And there's no way, by the way, because they ended up compromising on a manslaughter charge until the foreperson actually refused to affirm the verdict because she felt like she was being bullied into this verdict, that manslaughter fits these charges. And I will explain that to you in great detail a little bit in the later part of this video.
Prosecutors say Resiles broke into the 59-year-old's Davie home intending to commit burglary, but when he found her inside, tied her up and stabbed her 24 times. His DNA found on a knife and inside the home.
Yes, you heard that clearly. A jury refused to convict a young black man on charges of murder, even though DNA evidence shows that this man entered the home and his DNA is on the murder weapon. Also, during the course of this attempted burglary by Dayonte Resiles, Dayonte ended up discovering Jill Sue in her home, who he believed was not going to be present. During the course of this robbery gone wrong, Dayonte tied this woman up and then stabbed her 24 times to death in her own home, and somehow we're having a dispute on whether or not murder charges are fitting when his DNA matches the DNA on the murder weapon and his DNA is all over the home. This should be a slam dunk case. It's open and shut beyond any shadow of a doubt, and most importantly, the compromise charge that the jury was trying to settle on to give Dayonte a lighter sentence in no way, shape, or form fits the parameters of the crime. You can't make the case that this is a manslaughter. Remember, premeditation, intent to kill, can be established in an instant, a snap of the finger, and that's justification enough for premeditation. But also, we have something called felony murder in the United States of America, which means if during the course of a certain felony that you're committing, you end up killing somebody, the intent that was utilized in order for you to commit that felony gets applied to the homicide, thus making it a felony murder. Dayonte intended to break into this woman's house.
Prosecutors say Resiles broke into the 59-year-old's Davie home intending to commit burglary.
Now, after Dayonte broke into the home, which is something that he intended on doing, and by the way, take note of the fact that Dayonte brought the knife that ultimately ended up becoming the murder weapon, so I don't know whether or not I believe that this guy thought that the home was going to be unoccupied, and thus he just stumbled into a situation while committing a felony that he had no control over. But regardless of that fact, even if you do believe that he thought the home was going to be unoccupied, after he found the occupant, a 59-year-old woman, Jill Sue, Dayonte decided that his best course of action in that moment was to tie this woman up.
But when he found her inside, tied her up.
Yet another felony known as false imprisonment that should trigger a felony murder conviction if he was convicted on that underlying felony. After tying this woman up in her own home during the course of a burglary, we're now 2 felonies in, bare minimum, Dayonte decided that his only logical solution to the problem of him breaking into a home and the person who actually had a right to live in the home being there was to stab this woman more than 24 times. At what point Does the number of stabbings that you inflict on a person go beyond a manslaughter and go into an intentional homicide? I would argue after they're tied up, after they're completely hopeless and defenseless,
and stabbed her 24 times. His DNA found on a knife and inside the home.
we're well past the intent required for a murder conviction, and yet the jury wanted to compromise and let this monster out because of the color of his skin, because he killed an elderly white woman, and it might be considered a bit racist to convict him and hold him accountable for the crime that he actually committed. And here's the crazy thing. Dayonte is not a model prisoner while he's awaiting trial. And by the way, this crime occurred 7 years ago, right to a speedy trial, totally thrown amok in this case. Dayonte has actually escaped during the course of the proceedings related to this case.
He was arrested, charged with murder, and 2 years later escaped from the courthouse during a hearing. Investigators tracked him down nearly a week later.
2 years after he committed this murder, Dayonte just fled from a courthouse and the police had to track him down a week later. So this guy is not some innocent minority that was just struggling in order to get by. He was just Aladining. He needed to steal in order to get bread for those little Aladdins. This guy is a vicious, violent murderer who won't take any accountability for his crimes, and a jury of his peers decided that it might be okay to let him off easy, give him a bit of a slap on the wrist based on the crime that he actually committed, because, you know, he's a young black man and they don't want to ruin his life. You know, God forbid, the guy who murdered this woman in cold blood in her home by stabbing her more than 24 times has some inconveniences going on in his life.
Finally, in late November, the trial. And after 6 days of deliberation,
Ladies and gentlemen, it's my understanding you have reached a verdict.
they had Resiles guilty of manslaughter, or so it seemed. When it came time for the foreperson to confirm the verdict in open court, she couldn't do it.
This is your verdict?
No. I took a deep breath. I'm staring at the judge and at the clerk, and we're locking eyes, and I'm looking at each of one of them, and they're just waiting for my verdict of either yes, I agree, or no, and I just couldn't, and that's why I said no.
Now you might be saying, Sean, calm down. Manslaughter is still a very serious charge, and Dayonte Resiles might get a long sentence. He might get the full 15 years, and that's good enough for me, because when you break into a home, tie a woman up, and stab her to death for no reason, 15 years sounds like a fair sentence to you out there in the audience. I don't know who you are. I don't know who this imaginary person that I'm talking to actually is, but you might be saying that down in the comments below of this video. But here's the thing. Even in the strictest states, first of all, for the majority of states, you only have to serve between half and 2/3 of your sentence in order to get out on the charges that you're convicted of. But in the strictest states, they have something like an 85% rule. So even in the strictest states, you're only getting to serve 85% of your sentence. Dayonte Wright has already been in jail awaiting trial for 7 years related to this crime. And again, even in the strictest states that have that 85% rule, a lot of these states actually give you credit or double credit for time spent awaiting trial towards your sentence. 7 years in lockup on a sentence of 15 years that you only have to serve 85% of means that if Dayonte Resiles actually got convicted of manslaughter and he actually got the absolute maximum sentence related to his manslaughter, he could have walked out of that courtroom on the day of sentencing based on the credits that he would have accumulated. Do you think that's justice? Do you think that's fair? Do you think that's sensible for this monster who broke into a house and for no reason tied up an elderly woman and stabbed her repeatedly until she died because he didn't want to go to jail for a burglary?
She said most of the jury was ready to convict Resiles of at least second-degree murder, but 3 refused because the defendant is black. They compromised on manslaughter, but she said she had a pit in her stomach and she changed her mind.
Look, I know this gets played out. I know this really gets under people's skin when you do the thing where you invert the races, but let's just say for a moment that it was a young white man who broke into the home of a 59-year-old black woman, tied her up and stabbed her more than 24 times for no reason, and this person was not going to be convicted because 3 of the 12 jurors decided that they weren't going to send a young white man to death row or to jail for the rest of their lives. What if that were to be the case? And that's not a hypothetical. That's not a theoretical. That's not something that we need to try to figure out and solve as if it's the greatest math equation ever. That's something that used to happen in this nation. And based on the history of jurors who refuse to convict people based on the race and ethnic origin of the perpetrator and victim, we actually establish federal civil rights charges so that when they get let off for their crimes against minorities because the jury is sympathetic to them and they're basically giving them a free pass, the federal government could take up the case and charge them and at least get a conviction on something that they could stack on top of the reduced charges that they got at the state level or in place of the sentence that they should have gotten at the state level. So we've already had a response to this. We've already had our history with this. This has already been deemed unacceptable, yet in Broward County, Florida, not only was this attempted to be pulled off in a vicious murder case, but when the foreperson actually stood up for her principles, when she actually wanted to do her job as a juror, when she actually wanted her conscience to be reflected in the verdict and base the verdict on the charges, not the races, she was threatened in the jury room.
Returning to the jury room, she said she was cursed out, even threatened.
You guys keep saying a young black man, I don't see race. I just see a human being. And, you know, one particular person said to me, hey, if you were outside this courtroom, you would have gotten smacked out in the street for this.
Look, racial polarization is no joke. It can lead to civil wars, violence, genocide, the break apart of your nation. And it's important for all of us to buy into our nation as a whole to prevent this kind of thing from happening. And these little cases, these little instances of injustice that are reflected as revenge for a long racist past that supposedly is in the ether skewing all of these results are the foreground. They're the fertilizer in the sprout that will grow into racial polarization in this nation. We can't have it. It's unacceptable. If you're on a jury and you're set to convict somebody based on overwhelming evidence, like the evidence in this case, you cannot be talked down into a compromised charge by people who are showing an irrational sympathy for the perpetrator of the crime. It will only lead to downstream results that are horrible for this nation. And it's absolutely shameful that most of the jury were going to kowtow to these three racists on the jury and allow this to happen. But hey, those are just my thoughts. Let me know your thoughts down in the comments below. If you like this video, you can show me by leaving a like. You can subscribe for more content. You can follow me on all my social medias. You can support me via the support links in the description box. This has been me talking about somebody about to get a reduced charge, even though they unquestionably murdered somebody based on their race. Till next time.